As I've said before, the movie Airplane is not just my favorite movie, it is the best movie. And there are many lines in the movie Airplane that I love, but one of them is when Dr. Rumack is telling the flight attendant, Elaine Dickinson, "We must land this plane as soon as possible. Tell the captain that this woman is sick and has to be taken to a hospital." And Elaine says, "A hospital? What is it?" And he says, "It's a big building with patients, but that's not important right now." I tested that joke, and it worked well at the the 10:30 part of this service. But I guess that's what happens when you use it more than once. I say this because John's gospel functions on different planes. There's that type of wordplay all over John's gospel, where Jesus is speaking on a different plane than the crowds. They are talking past each other. And really, there's actually three planes that are going on in John's gospel. The people are often on the second plane, but Jesus is either on a third plane or this first plane. What do I mean by that? Well, on the one hand, there's lots of very high spiritual talk in John's gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Without him, nothing came into being. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am sending you my advocate, the Spirit of truth. I'm being taken out of the world, but I'm not going to have lost any of the ones that were entrusted to me. I mean, Jesus is talking on this very, very high spiritual level through much of John. But on the other hand, John's gospel can be very down to earth, literally feeding people with bread, drawing water out of a well with the woman from Samaria, creating wine for a party and a wedding reception. And there's lots of talk about literal earthiness in terms of vines and branches and fruit. So this leads to lots of misunderstanding between Jesus and his listeners. And one example is at the beginning of this passage, right where the reading begins. The crowd is trying to catch up with Jesus, and they've been counting the boats that are on the shore, and they knew that he hadn't rowed to the other side of the lake with his disciples, and something didn't add up, and so they ask him, "When did you come here?" Totally overlooking the mystery of what we read about last week, which was Jesus walking across the water. They don't ask him how. They ask him, "When did you get here?" They don't worry about the fact that he would have answered, "Oh, instead of catching a ride on the boat, I just walked across, like you do." And in the same way, during this passage, they stay focused just on the bread. Remember, he has fed the 5,000 with the 5 loaves. We did that last week. And that's what they're focused on. How can we get free bread every day forever? Boy, that would be nice. They don't even consider that perhaps this one who is literally able to multiply bread out of nothing might be able to bless them in ways far, far beyond just the plain bread that they need for survival. But see, there also seems to be a second level of functioning going on. There also seems to be an element of social and political maneuvering on the part of the crowds. When they realize he can provide for their basic material needs, the last thing that we read after the feeding of the 5,000 is that they wanted to take him away and make him their king. When he's talking to them this week, they want to see signs. They want to see spectacles. Almost like they just forgot the sign that he just performed from them. What more sign do you need? He made bread for 5,000 out of 5 loaves. But it's almost like they want to see it again for the sake of their Instagram feeds, for the thrill of it all, for the bragging rights about being in the room where it happened. They compare him to Moses, who was their hero from generations in the past, as the one who gave them bread from heaven. And Jesus has to correct them and say, no, it wasn't Moses who gave you bread from heaven. It was God who still gives you true bread from heaven, even now. There's a lot of connections between this story and the story of Jesus interacting with the woman at the well from Samaria. And another parallel is that woman is also caught up in that second plane. She enters into this debate with him that's rife with politics about the right place to worship, whether it's at the temple in Jerusalem or whether it's at the mountain in Samaria. Again, trying to use Jesus as a political or sort of social tool to justify their social position. So Jesus is providing for people's basic needs here to alleviate hunger and to alleviate suffering, but he's not doing it for fame or reputation or politics. He's doing it so that they might have a relationship with God, so that they might abide in Him as the source of true bread, that they might set their sights and efforts on loving God and on loving their neighbors rather than defeating their enemies, advancing their social status, gaining luxuries and material possessions. During this series where we are celebrating the Lord's Supper every week, I'm reminded that that is, at the end of the day, what a sacrament is. A universally understood and appreciated symbol of God's abundance. As Seth said during our Worship 101 time, something that is common, something that is ordinary, and that it is through that commonness, through that simple, super simple, basic necessity of life, that first level, that first plane, that we're able to access the higher level, the higher plane, through the looking down at the essence of life. Bread, sustenance, is universal. We're having gluten-free bread so that it can be universal. It represents the basic food of any culture. Water, too, is universal. The water of baptism represents the essence of life. Baptism and communion remind us that God is the source of life, that God desires that all have clean, fresh water. Jesus feeds the people first, literally fills their bellies, provides for their material needs before he goes to that third higher plane, because God desires that all have bread. And it is truly God's prerogative to determine that all have bread, because without God, none of us would have any bread or any water. That's when it's so easy to get into that second plane of existence. And we start linking whether someone deserves bread or water to their citizenship or to their work ethic or to their ability to pay or their religious affiliation or their gratitude for getting this free bread and water. Or maybe we link it with their criminal record or their substance abuse history. We get caught up in that middle plane. And Jesus pulls us down to say, hey, this is the basics for existence. It all comes from the highest plane. It all comes from God. When we get caught up in that middle plane, we're revealing our own brokenness, our own distance, when we dare to think that we can decide to whom is offered the basic necessities of life. And Jesus drove this home with the fact that he didn't just multiply the 5 loaves and 2 fish to have enough to serve 5,000 people. Those 5,000 people had as much to eat as they could eat, and there were also 12 baskets of food left over. In other words, like the manna in the wilderness, until nobody has any rainy day food left over, until nobody has any extra bread left over in the pantry for tomorrow, then it is quite plainly God's will that nobody go without the daily bread and water for basic existence. But how often do we wealthy, powerful Christians do theological gymnastics to justify our own excess or our nation's excess in the face of someone else's suffering or some other people's lack? How often do we Christians go straight for that middle plane of social status, political wealth, power, possessions? Speaking of that dangerous middle plane between the down-to-earth simplicity of daily life and the spiritual heavenly plane of relationship with God, I saw the perfect illustration of this in the form of a Facebook post, which was a screen grab from a local news segment. The headline graphic at the top of the page was about the billionaire's race to space in self-funded rockets, while the ticker on the bottom had a story that was labeled "Millions of Americans Facing Eviction." Yes, this is the outcome when we work for the bread of the world instead of the bread of life. This is the outcome when we trust in the Antichrist who supposedly gives Christians the ability to achieve our goals and realize our fantasies instead of the crucified Christ who gave up power and ambition for the sake of love. This is what happens. First, we convince ourselves that a luxury car will give us fulfillment, then a vacation home, then a boat, then a jet, then another and another, until finally we are literally building rocket ships. Because somehow we think that will take us up to that higher plane. When instead, there are literally signs of Christ's grace and abundance all around us. all around us in the daily, earthy, material existence of eating and drinking and loving one's neighbor. This week, if you've been paying attention to the Olympics, you've already been blessed with an example of what it looks like to examine the different planes on which we are living. NBC did a bunch of photo shoots for its Olympic promos featuring gymnast Simone Biles standing with a literal goat. In internet language, goat stands for greatest of all time. I mean, that is how high she had been elevated. Her Olympic victories were the closest that you can get to a sure thing in the world of sports. She's invented her own gymnastics moves that nobody else can do. She comes across as superhuman. But between the news stories and the hype, the actual goat, the eyes of the entire world watching, the weight of a nation still desperate for inspiration and normalcy in the midst of a pandemic, she started making mistakes. That superhumanity started cracking to reveal an ordinary human woman. And finally, instead of powering through, instead of sucking it up and pretending like everything was fine for the good of her country, she dropped out, citing her own mental health needs. I don't know what was in her mind, but perhaps she decided that too much of her life had been devoted to that middle plane. The fame, the gold medals, being the GOAT, number one, not just in 2020, but for all times. Caught up in being the avatar for our country, offering the living proof that we are the greatest. And I say that perhaps that is what was going through her mind because her reasons for withdrawing pointed to both of those other planes. On the one hand, she recognized that mental health is not divorced from physical health. And that truth is perhaps best demonstrated through a world-class gymnast. If her brain is unable to command her body to do what it's capable of, she risks broken bones, paralysis, even death, that first plane of existence. And on the other hand, she realized that being the GOAT, having the golds, is ultimately not the bread that satisfies. She said that she realized her worth did not come from her accomplishments or her abilities, that she was more than her medals, that she had value as a human being, a person created in God's image, a sibling of Christ. And by reminding the world that she will not be reduced to a national symbol or a feel-good source of pride, she's held up a mirror for the rest of us. Where does your worth come from? Toward what bread are you working? The bread of more? The bread of comfort, the bread of success and ambition and greatness, or the bread of life, the bread that is Christ's body, the source of truth, the source of life, the bread that comes from compassion, connection, grace, and love. Which plane are you on? Thanks be to God. Amen.